Hi, I'm John Tiedemann, Director of the Monmouth University Marine and Environmental Biology and Policy Program. We're here today to talk about best practices for catch and release of striped bass. I've got a panel of experts here that come from both the academic side of research as well as the angling community. We have authors, we have avid anglers, and in fact all of us, regardless of our walk of life, are in fact avid striped bass anglers. First, we have Chris Wojcik. Chris is a marine biologist and a filmmaker. He has a program called Eye on Nature, where he develops displays for aquariums and zoos, and he also creates some fantastic artificial reef art that's sunk at artificial reefs around the country. Next, we have Lou Tabry. Lou is a renowned angler and author, as well as an educator. Lou's got classic fly patterns that he's developed that many anglers use for inshore fly fishing as well as striped bass fishing. And his two books, Inshore Fly Fishing and Stripers on the Fly, are among the most well-read in the country. Andy Danilchuk is a professor of fisheries conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Not only being an avid angler, Andy is an expert on the impacts of recreational angling on a variety of game fish, including bonefish, and most recently doing a lot of research related to striped bass. Tom Lynch is here. Tom is an avid saltwater angler. He's an outdoor writer, he's a filmmaker, and he's a photographer, and his photographs, for example, run often in On the Water magazine. He had some tremendous footage from a shark feeding frenzy last year that went viral and was on national TV, so some people may have seen some of his video footage. And last but not least, we have Bob Popovics. Bob is a respected angler. He's created a number of saltwater fly patterns that people use not only for saltwater fly fishing, but people like myself use for the teasers on our striped bass rigs. And recently, Bob wrote a book all about fly tying and his fly patterns called Pop Flies. Okay, guys, we're going to talk about striped bass catch and release and striped bass angling and what the status of the striped bass fishery is. I guess the first thing we could talk about is if there's a 2-fish bag limit, 2 fish per person a day, even though some anglers don't say that they're practicing catch and release, by default, to comply with the regulations, this is one of the things we've been looking at and trying to educate anglers about. They are practicing catch and release. So the idea is, what are you doing right and what are you doing wrong? What are some of the practices that we see that are kind of, I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. What's good, what's bad, and what's really, really ugly that's going to hurt that fish to the point where even if you are releasing it, there's going to be mortality or damage to the fish.
John, over the years, I've noticed how you see a lot of people, like you said now, they have to learn how to practice catch and release. Because you either catch your limit in your first 2 fish and you go home, or sooner or later you're going to have to catch a fish and release them. So you have to know how to do it properly. This is what was concerning to us at this stage. We notice how the guys will take the fish and they have to put them back, but sometimes they carry them through the sand if they're fishing in the surf. They take them all the way up to their trucks to take the hooks out of them, and then sometimes they go down to the water and they may throw them 30 feet into the water rather than doing as trout fishermen would do. They'll just go down into the water, let them go in there calmly as they possibly can. The only thing is they're not doing it necessarily, at least I don't think so, that they're doing it out of just disregard for them. I think they're doing it because that's all that they know. They don't know a lot of the pitfalls of not releasing a fish properly. And I think one of the strong driving forces behind this is to try to teach them how to release their fish properly by what we're finding in Andy's research with the mortality rates after that, and we're trying to make it better. So if we can get the word out to more guys how to properly release fish, we think you're going to stop seeing or start seeing an ending to a lot of the abuse, well intended, though, you know, in most cases, not that they're trying to do anything bad. They don't know the right way to do it. And as anything else, as we find things from year to year, that may change. The most acceptable ways to do it may change. So we have to stay vigilant as to keep on giving information out there. But once the information is given to these fishermen, I think they're going to accept it, embrace it, and practice it. And I think that's what our job is.
You know, but I think they're just so excited once they catch a fish that they just want to get it off the hook as quickly as they can to get their line back out there to try to catch another one. You know, it's sort of, that's the way bass fishing works. It's really kind of fits and starts.
Oh, yeah,
and
no doubt.
the bass are coming through in a big school. You get a fish and you want to make sure that if you're not going to keep the fish, you can get it off the line as quickly as you can and get your line back out there so you can catch another one. So I think it's about promoting a responsibility that once you bring that fish to your feet, you have a responsibility to take care of it all the way until the
Absolutely.
release.
It doesn't stop with catching the fish.
Right.
It stops once that fish gets back to its element safely.
Right.
And I think part of the responsibility, though, starts with, I reflect back a lot when I was much younger and started to learn how to fish, and all the information was how to actually catch the fish, not what you actually need to do with the fish once you have it in your hands.
Right.
And so I think that this development of best practices for catch and release, whether you want to voluntarily practice catch and release, or you ultimately at one point want to catch and keep a fish, but your fish might be undersized or you've maxed out your limit, that we still have to be conscientious about the point at which the angler has to make a decision of how they get the hook out, how they're handling the fish, how long they're keeping the fish out of water, because as the whole title of this piece is about the future of the fishery, I mean, that's where the future lies. Once that fish goes back in the water, whether that fish is ultimately going to go try and reproduce, hopefully, or grow to a size where it can be harvested, the fate of that fish and it's in the angler's hands is incredibly important. And one thing that I try to convey when I talk to angler groups is, in many cases, it doesn't take another $29.95 tool, or it doesn't take some extra financial output on their part. It's just taking a bit of time to learn the best practices that are out there. And I think in terms of this group, a question I have maybe to Lou and to Bob is, have you guys seen the perception of best practices change over time when it comes to handling fish? I know we can beat up on managers and management, but I'm curious about how anglers actually interface with that fish and the perception.
I think they're starting to realize that, as we started this by stating, sooner or later they have to release a fish for obvious reasons. So I think they're trying. Some guys may police it a little bit on the beach. Throwing that fish 30 feet in the air is not helping it. I mean, sure, you're releasing the fish, but that fish might not make it back.
So Andy, following up on what Bob was saying, a lot of your research has focused on this idea of how the fish are stressed and how that stress impacts the fish. Like Bob said, we might not visually see this when we see the fish and bring it out of the water, but in fact, the angling event really does stress them, correct?
Yeah, definitely. We consider being on the end of a line as exercise. And just like when we go out and exercise, your body needs to respond physiologically to deal with that. So not only do you have this exercise-induced stress, which if we use essentially blood physiology, so for the research that we do, we look at the levels of blood lactate and glucose, which are two sort of indicators of the stress level. We've been able to document in a range of species that with increased angling times, we see that those stress levels do go up. And I think that the angling is one thing, the exercise-induced stress, but I think the added sort of stress is when all of a sudden you have that fish, and then you need to take the hook out, or you want to have a photo taken. And so the fish has been exercised, and then as Bob put it, you take it out of its element. Fish's gills, they're not designed to work out of water. So I tend to kind of humanize it a bit, and you think about going and running around the block 3 or 4 times and then having somebody involuntarily stick a bag over your head. That would be sort of the analogy of playing a fish on the end of a fishing line for 5 minutes, 3 minutes, however long it might be, and it's obviously size dependent. And then you go and take the fish out of the water, And it needs that oxygen to recover from that physiological stress that it just experienced on that line. So I think independent of the species, whether it's striped bass, bonefish, bluefish, the more we can do to inform anglers to minimize or reduce or eliminate air exposure, the better off it will be for fish. And I think we also see that the impacts of air exposure and angling time changes with water temperature. Fish are interesting in that as the water temperature increases, their metabolism increases. And if they're already metabolically stressed and then we put a hook in their mouth or they grab onto a bait and they fight, then that adds that elevated stress.
Right, and then there's also been studies that show for a fish like the striper that's in coastal waters as well as coming into the estuaries and coastal rivers, that the fresher the water, the lower the salinity in the upper reaches of the estuaries, with higher temperatures can increase that stress as well.
Yeah, and I would say that a really good message to get out to the angling community is that when in doubt, again, minimize or even reduce air exposure.
Yeah.
And then there are, I think, other things that can lead up to how do you do that?
Yeah.
What are the tricks that you need to do to reduce air exposure or minimize it? Does it go back to the tackle? Does it go back to how do anglers learn to handle a fish? Is it do you grab it by the lip? Do you grab it under the belly? Do you grab it near the water? And I think why I got so interested in the striped bass fishery, which kind of complicates things, is that there's such a diverse way that striped bass are angled. On the fly, off the beach, on a boat, off a jetty, off a bridge, with trolling behind a boat. So that I think that as we develop best practices, if we want to be precautionary before all the studies are done, independent of how you fish for striped bass, again, going back, minimizing, reducing, or like eliminating air exposure is probably going to be a really good starting point.
One of the things I know for me, being mostly a surf fisherman, I have a way that I'll bring my fish to the beach where I never have to lift it up. Okay, I'll bring it into a safe spot. This is not for every single fish. This is the ideal situation now I'm talking about. I'll bring the fish up while it's still wet in the sand right in front of me where the wave brought him to that point. 2 or 3 waves might not reach him again, but by the 3rd wave, it may come back. And by that time, with the barb down, I'll take the hook out real easy. And then if I do anything, I'll just turn his nose back to the water. And when that other wave comes, sure enough, you stay there with him, boom, off he goes, swims right there. He doesn't hardly know where, worse for wear.
If you're fishing, Bob, if you're fishing structure like up off of Maine, you're fishing ledges, it's the same thing. You've got to, when you start fishing a location, you've got to figure out where you're going to land them first because it's so dangerous with the surf. And then you've got to have a spot, and what you do is you have to have a place where you can put it. It's almost like a pond, where the wave breaks in and you let the fish go, and then the wave carries it out. But that's like what you're doing is with the boat. That's tough. Yeah,
it is.
Because that's you're talking about a lot of hooks.
Yeah.
Everything's flying around. You got to throw that fish in the boat. Now you've got to, and I'm sure there are big barbs on those hooks. You've got to handle them carefully. That's much more difficult than we're running.
Right.
Into.
But this is how sort of a lot of the research that I've been doing on bonefish has evolved, in that it's been communicating with anglers and guides that are saying, yeah, I realize that we need to develop these best practices, but here's a bottleneck. Maybe can we develop a technique, or can we do the research that will allow us to develop the best practices in this scenario? So, I mean, even thinking about, trawling behind a boat and you happen to hook into 4 or 5 fish, how about a series, and this might be a case where it might cause some expense, but little aerated live wells in the back where you put an individual fish in. If we determine that air exposure is the big culprit that increases the amount of stress and changes the survival rate of the fish, then maybe that's something we can start to test and then advocate.
Tom, your photo.
Do you still go by the, when you pick that fish up, you hold your breath? Does that work?
I go by that.
But it's too long.
It's
isn't
too
it?
long because
Okay.
I can hold my breath a
Okay.
long time.
Yeah.
So
But maybe most people can't. So that's
so what I do now is when independent, whether it's striped bass, bonefish, barracuda, trout, is I ask that people encourage the person with the camera to call the shots. Yeah. That fish stays in the water until, especially in the case where somebody's got a trophy or, wants to have their first picture taken with a nice brook trout or something, and that the person with the camera says, okay, on 3, I want you to lift that fish out of the water. 1, 2, 3. Fish is out of the water. Fish is dripping in the photo, and then it's released.
I'm
and
sure
even
that's okay with Tom. He probably
would
rather a lot of people do that.
Yeah. Tom,
it even looks better on camera.
I was going to ask you, your photos and your videos have been featured in a lot of different places, including On the Water magazine, and they really, I love the way you go out in the field and really document the good ways to do things. What are some of the things you've been seeing when you spend time on the beach that people could easily correct?
Well, one of the first things is a lot of anglers will grab a fish, just jam their hands up the gills and hit the gill rakes, and then hold the fish vertically. And getting them to cradle the fish correctly and hold it. I won't take pictures anymore of guys unless it's a trophy fish and they've kept it on land, but I don't want the fish held that way. I want them cradled correctly. And I think that a lot of people don't even realize how much damage they do to a fish when they stick their hand up the gill and hit the gill rakes or hold it in that fashion. So that's one of the first things I do is just make sure that they're handling the fish correctly.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a good point. And I want to say something that one of the magazines, the government magazines, it was last year, they had a guy, now this is a fish biologist, hand in the gills, holding up the fish, and this is supposed to be something. Now what they did, they just showed a number of people how to do it wrong.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I've done it wrong. I have some myself,
We
with
all
some beautiful
have.
fish that
We all
I'm
have.
embarrassed to
We
show
learn.
people now.
It's a great handle.
We're
It just
learning
is.
Yeah.
So where should you put your hands then?
We put them under the belly, on the back of the belly, and then under, like, below the shoulders.
Right. And what about the initial pickup? In the mouth is better, right? People need to know that if they're getting into striped bass fishing, that fish is not going to clamp down on your finger and bite you like a bluefish would, right?
There's sharper things in the gills. I mean, I've
Yeah.
gotten much worse cuts on my fingers
Yeah.
from the gills than I have from the teeth.
But then, so then you see people with grippers on a striper, a big lip gripper. Is there really a need for something like
Well,
that
the
with
thing
a bass?
is, you don't want to be pulling that jaw down.
Right.
You don't mind holding him by the lower lip and allowing the fish to naturally drape. You don't want to pull it back like you see the largemouth bass boys do all the time, and they show them all over the place. This is, that's not supposed to be. That's unnatural for that fish.
Right.
So the key is just hold him, get a grip, work on your fish, getting back as soon as possible, or if it's generally on a smaller fish, but the bigger ones, you may have to brace them so that their bellies and their backbones or whatever, you don't want them sliding and disjoining or whatever that would be.
That's
you
a
know
really,
what I'm saying?
really important point.
So bracing them underneath is very, very important. And that's starting to see more and more of that.
One thing that's been done for other species, and not striped bass, and it's some work that needs to be done for striped bass, is that when you think about when a fish is in its natural environment, its body weight is supported by the water.
Right.
And then so all the stuff around its guts and its bellies are happily, hanging below.
yeah.
And so when you take that fish out of the water and no longer has that water to support it, and it's just got gravity, and you're holding it upside down, it can result in basically tearing of the integument, all the stuff on. There's some damages that we might not see, and we might not see the immediate impacts as you release the fish. But if there's enough internal damage, then perhaps that fish won't reproduce that year, or it might have trouble feeding. There was an interesting study done with a species from Australia that showed that when fish were held vertically, it actually dislocated a couple vertebrae. And unless you took the X-rays and you could see that, you would never know. But when you think about what some dislocated vertebrae would do for any other vertebrate, that would be a problem. Yeah. So I think that just recognizing the basic, the basic biology, how fish live in their environment, leads into the development of these best practices. Even going back to the fact that the gills, it's not even just the rakers. I mean, it's the fine filaments on there that when you take the fish out of the water, the gill filaments themselves have a little bit of mucus on them, and when you take them out of the water, and those filaments, when they're in the water, are meant to be creating a lot of surface area so you get more oxygen into the blood. When you take them out of the water, those filaments collapse and they stick together. And so then you put the fish back in the water, and if it takes a while for those filaments to unstick, then it's it takes much longer for those fish to actually recover from that exercise and everything they've just experienced. So it's not even just the rakers, it's the fine parts in the
All
gills.
right, that leads me, my next question would be to you on that would be, how about when, and I've done this myself, where you slide your hand underneath the gill,
Yeah.
but stay high in the gill, you don't go to the rakers. Is that a good spot or a bad spot?
I would
Where
stay
we go?
away
Stay
from the
away
gills.
from the gills totally.
I mean, that's in terms of recovering from the angling event, in terms of, you know, eventually needing to go and chase prey and do other things. You know, that's how those fish keep
That's
their
the
blood
vital
oxygen. That's
spot.
so
Yeah.
vital.
We really want to avoid the gills and the eyes, correct?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
try to keep that mucus coating on the fish as much as
It
possible.
can also
Can we
protect
wet
the mouth
hands?
too.
Yeah.
You know, protect that mouth, especially if you've caught it on, you know, some of those big rigs that you're using or big plugs.
Don't throw
You
me
know,
under the bus. Lou.
they're tough. Those are tough, man. Well, you catch a smaller fish on a big plug. It's why I've fished barbless hooks on plugs for years. You've got to be careful when you're handling that fish. And sometimes they're hooked in the side, so you've got this setup. So, you know, having barbless hooks, again, they come right out. And also anglers should think about something. They're also protecting themselves.
Yeah, Tom, you and I have
Because
talked
you're
about
always going to hook
plugs.
yourself.
Absolutely.
There's other
So-
things you can do to a plug to make it a little bit better, right? You can
A
modify your
lot of the
plugs.
guys that are fishing big plugs, they'll have, like on a big swimming plug, they might have 2 sets of trebles underneath and then another sidewash hook
Yeah,
off the back.
Yeah, that's right. Single on the back
That's
is always
7
good.
hooks that you got a fish dealing with. And look, good development recently has been that some of the big swimmers are being made with a single treble hook on the belly and then a flag on the back, so there's no hook.
Yeah.
And then if you crimp that and make that barbless, it's pretty easy to get
Yeah.
that fish off.
Yeah. What are some other gear considerations? We were kind of talking about best practices and things that anglers can do that really doesn't modify their gear too much or doesn't make them spend money. What are some other simple considerations on gear choices?
Sometimes it's something as simple as stouter tackle.
The
So
old
that they
way was
eliminate the excessive long fight.
to give the fish more of a chance. That was the old way of thinking. I'm
Oh,
going to use
yeah.
lighter tackle.
Yeah,
because
as
it
light
gives
as
fun.
possible is no good,
That's
right?
the-
But
Yeah,
still,
that's the
also,
worst thing you can
not
do.
so much even just the tackle, but the technique. Learning technique, being responsible enough to say, I want to get that fish in as soon as I can.
Yeah.
Learn how to fight a fish.
And how to set your drag, right?
Set your drag as part of it. What weight line are you using? What pound test? Something stronger so that you can have total control over the fish. And most of the time, it's the cast, it's the hookup, it's the setup. That's where all your fun is remembered in that moment. A little bit towards a fight. So, you know, if you can get that fish in quicker, you get a chance to go back out there and experience that cast, that hookup and initial hit, initial run, and get that fish in as quick as possible. Boom. Through good fighting.
You know,
and
Bob, it's
whatever.
one of the negatives of world records. These people are going
Oh,
out
with
there,
lighter tackle.
2 pound, 4 pound, 6 pound. Some fish, you can't fish for, on something that light. You have to go to something that's stouter to land the fish quickly.
Right.
2 pound test, 4 pound test, they're not putting any pressure on the fish. The fish swims around to the point where it's totally exhausted. Even though, as you said, they let that fish go, it's not going to live.
You know,
It's not
Louis
gonna live.
knows well too that you'd be surprised how much you can do with 10-pound test. You could probably pull a cameraman across that floor if you use the right techniques. A lot of times the people don't understand the limits of their tackle and they don't utilize it enough. So, I mean, just something very simple, very visual for most people to realize. You'll hear somebody talk about how much pressure they were putting on a fish by how high they were pulling. Well, they're not putting any more there's no more pressure being put on that fish at that rod attitude. The most pressure you can do is straight on. So everything close to straight is when you're giving the most pressure on your fish. So if you really want to fight a fish, you stay more at that attitude. The only thing you lose in the very beginning, if you're using some lighter stuff, you lose any surge protection of that the rod would naturally give you, as that fish will be pulling at a inopportune time. So it's just learning these certain techniques and heavier, stouter tackle.
What kind of alternatives can we offer for the jetty fishermen, other than gaffing every fish that's coming up?
You had an interesting idea.
Well, there's again, being creative, as Louis was saying, fishing the shores in New England on those cliffs and stuff. You find your exit. Well, you need one for yourself, and you also need one way where you're going to bring your fish up. What we were using, like false albacore with a fly, we learned right away you don't want to eat false albacore. So we're not going to keep any of them. So if we're catching them, we want to minimize them. As far as we don't want to go down necessarily, or if we don't want to gaff them because you're going to kill them. So we would find spots where we could get them up easily, but by using strong 20-pound to 30-pound tippets straight from the fly line to the fly, we were able to find a good spot and then just put the rod down on a rock and then just pull them straight up. With that 20 and 30-pound test, those 8 or 9 or 10-pound false albacore are not going to break off. You don't have to go down into the danger zone to get them. They're fine. You get them up quick, take them off, put them back down like a torpedo, and then you're gone.
Without the fish even touching the rocks or anything, right?
Well, you can do. You're going to slide them, but don't
careful.
forget the rocks at least are wet.
Yeah.
You know, you got to find a good spot, and your landing spot might not always be where you're fishing from, but you're going to find a better spot, or you can minimize the distance. So that would be more opportunity. You don't always have the most opportune spot, but you make the most of it.
But on a shorter jetty, you can walk. So
That's
once
right,
you're hooked
walk
up,
right
you
in.
can walk
You go right to the
off
beach.
the jetty, right?
But in a lot of these blitz situations, you've got guys fishing as tight as we are on this stage, and you can't walk a fish. Like,
Yeah.
How
you're
about
stuck.
a net in that situation? Is that an option at all?
I've never really seen
I've
it.
seen them. I've seen them on the.
But you've got to get down, so you have to have good footwear.
Right.
That's the other
We'll wear
thing.
corkers.
And
Oh,
you
yeah,
see
it's
people that don't have good footwear, they're stuck.
Yep.
But they shouldn't even be
They
on the
should be
jetty.
on a rock
Yeah.
without proper corkers.
But what's the consensus on nets and fish? How does it work on them as far as the slime and?
Yeah, you know, a knotless net that's, I've seen the more sensitive or the less impactful nets are the rubberized ones that are relatively smooth. Anything that has, you know, a thin nylon with knots that can get up under the gills, you know, that's...
Yeah, those knotted poly like green nets,
those
they're
things
the
are not-
worst.
See, and things are, tackle is moving in the right direction if they get enough input from people like us and others that want changes made, they'll adapt to it. And as science finds out more and more all the time, and as soon as we can get something like that and say, okay, listen, this net is good, this is the kind to have, this is not good for this reason or whatever, you're gonna have more people looking to go get the right one.
And a question I have for everybody here is that, you know, based on your experiences, where did you learn best practices? Did you learn it from another angler? Did you learn it from a magazine? I mean, we talked a little bit about photos. I had a group of students comb the internet looking at angler club web pages that said anything about conservation, and then I looked at all the photos that they had that were posting, and the photos didn't necessarily match the message that they were trying to get across. So I think that, you know, just based on everybody's experience here, I mean...
Me, I got mine a little bit everywhere. That's the best way to say it, from other guys, periodicals, magazines, and then I've also seen practices that were learned years ago as the right way to do it change as things went. So people have to stay vigilant as to be up to date on what's now known, and that's your job to find those answers.
And also, Bob, people didn't release fish years ago like they're
right.
doing today.
Big time.
I mean, you think about, you know, the mentality of the fishermen in some of these locations. I used to let fish go. Guys would holler at me.
Absolutely.
They wanted that fish to sell it. I mean, I've taken some nice sized fish, and these guys would get mad at you. And that was the mentality. And until we can keep changing that, I think, you know, that's one of the things we need to do. And we learn it, yeah.
I got a picture of a bunch of striped bass, Tom would know.
It's hard. It's a shopping basket.
On a shopping cart, because we used to sell them back then. This is back in the 70s.
Yeah.
But that's up there. As you walk right in, it's the first thing you see. That's to say we came from This is
That-
what we used to do, but then we learned more and we've chosen. Ours was the first generation that chose to release fish.
Yeah.
Before it never was done. Now they have to. This is what we're saying. But that was there to say, this is how we started. We used to do this, but now we chose not to do this anymore. Okay? They weren't just all my bass, by the way. But you know, this is just like you're saying. Years ago, we didn't release fish. My father never released fish unless he had enough.
We don't have as many as we used to. We all want to keep catching these fish forever. We want our kids to be able to catch them. And the only way to do that is to make sure that we are responsible along the way. So, you know, Bill
I'm
Fish is a
seeing-
good one to look at.
Go ahead,
I was
Tom.
gonna say, I'm seeing a lot of changes within the fishing clubs now that had kill tournaments. And like Berkeley Striper Club, they now have a catch and release tournament.
Right.
And that's becoming much more popular. And then tackle shops, just within the past month, basically to get your name in a tackle shop website and in their book and get the accolades of catching a fish, you had to drag the dead fish in, have it weighed. Now, like Grumpy's down at Seaside Park has a catch and release book.
Right.
Where you can go in, sign where you caught them, you know, not necessarily exact locations, but how much it weighed, how long it was. I got a copy of that
You
book.
don't want emails, right?
But you can put that information into a book, and then they'll put that on the website. So people that were out killing a fish specifically to bring it into a shop just to get their name on a site can now go in and sign the honor book. When you catch a fish in the surf right now, first thing somebody asks you is, did you catch it on bait or did you get it on a plug? And that's kind of, if you got it on bait, it's not as impressive to the quote unquote fisherman that if you got it on a plug. I'd like to see in the future, they say, did you get them barbless or barbed? Because catching a fish on a barbless hook is a lot more challenging.
Or did you get it on a circle hook on that bait?
Yeah, but most of us, well, I guess on the plugs are starting to do some of that.
So one of the things that I think is important is I started actually becoming an avid striped bass fisherman during the 1980s when the population had crashed and there was a moratorium on the commercial harvest. And we really have a lot of anglers now that have kind of gotten into the fishery in the last 10 or 15 years and don't understand how the fluctuation in populations can go. And so they've gotten into it in these banner years. Like Bob was describing before, if you got into it in the last 5 years in New Jersey, you thought, wow, this is some fishery. You can go out there in the spring and fall and catch fish like mad. So there's another important factor in terms of educating anglers to the fact that it's important with catch and release, even if you're going to keep a couple fish, to do things right so we don't see that happen again. So I wonder if anybody else has a perspective on that.
Well, you know what happened? If you look, I can see it climb, I could see it climb and drop now twice. And the interesting thing that happened the first time, there were tons of fish, but there were no rules. People kept everything. So when it collapsed quickly. Now there's rules. It's collapsing slowly.
Yeah.
That's the problem. The one interesting thing back then, when the fishery did collapse, it's when I was able to take all my big fish on fly. You didn't catch many fish, but when you caught a fish, it was 30 to 40 pounds. That's what was amazing. There was literally no fish under 20 to 25 pounds for a few years. And then when it collapsed, it just, boom, the bottom dropped out of it.
How do you get that across to people? That's the question. For the
That's-
folks who are
it's-
just new into the fishery.
You have to explain how lucky they are to have the fishing they do out of New Jersey. Take a 2-week trip up to Cape Cod and see what it's like.
And that's really the idea of this campaign, is to get the word out through a variety of media to different types of groups of anglers on what they can and can't do. Simple things that they can do that can help improve the situation. I wonder if maybe we could just go down the line and have people kind of give their perspective on that, where we are now and where we can go with this particular issue. Maybe we'll start with Bob.
I'll begin it with just by saying over my years, for me, I think education of the fishermen is important. So you got education, conservation of the species, respect for the resource, and put your barbs down. Okay? So it goes, you have to educate the fishermen, care about the resource, pay attention to conservation issues and what's going on in the feeding grounds of the estuaries and all that stuff that supports everything. And then do your best as a fisherman to learn techniques to make it all happen.
I agree, ditto with everything Bob said, but then on top of that, I think as a fisherman and out there evangelizing this, the techniques we're talking about, we need the science behind it. Otherwise, you're labeled as a tree hugger. But if you have the actual science behind you, like you guys, it makes your argument that much more compelling, and people will listen. They'll be more inclined to listen.
Yeah, and I guess I'm on both sides as a scientist and as an angler, and I think that in both cases, it really comes down to personal responsibility. And I think a lot of the message that we've been trying to develop here is, one overarching theme is being proactive, is thinking about, before you, put your lure in the water, have you crimped the barbs down? Where's the exit point for that fish if you're fishing on a jetty? Or if the industry's developing new tools, new techniques, work with the scientific community to do the research to determine whether that particular tool is going to increase survival of that fish. I don't think we can just develop these techniques and not formally test them and understand what the fate is, or the potential fate of those tools are on that fish and techniques.
It's funny. I've been teaching fly fishing schools for about 30 years. And the one thing that the students were always interested in, once you talk to them and you spend a little time with them, how do I protect the fish? What's important? And if we can just use just that kind of knowledge and you start to talk to people on the beach. I'm not afraid to go up and talk to people. And you'll find that these people, in most cases, they'll appreciate it. Some people never will, and you're never going to reach those people. But just teaching, that's so important. And it's just from fighting a fish, to landing a fish, to letting the fish go, and then also have them think about conservation and what we need to do to protect the whole environment that'll help the fishery.
Coming from the perspective that I come from, which is educating the public in zoos and aquariums and natural history museums. And my responsibility, along with getting the facts across, is to how to get people to care or to empathize and feel like conserving whatever this particular resource is that we're talking about. And I think that the real challenge for those of us who feel that this is important is, how do we get that message across without sounding preachy? What are some creative methods that we can have to convey this message so that, you always want someone to think that it was their idea whenever you want them to have a particular idea. How do we get it across so they're proud of the fact that they do this, and they're talking among their peer group and encouraging their friends and their kids and the people, their club members, to participate in this, and that's sort of the challenge for us, is to try to be creative about it, so as not to turn people off and say, oh, it's some of my least favorite types of books I like to read are environmental literature, and I'm very much of a conservationist because I just feel that someone is preaching to me and I sort of shut it off. So it's sort of incumbent upon us, because I think that we have a pretty diverse background. So I mean, we're all friends, but I don't know if all of our friends would necessarily be friends. We come from very different, backgrounds. So I think just trying to come up with these creative ways to get that message out is sort of our responsibility.
Exactly, and that's the whole reason we started this campaign, Stripers for the Future. We'd like to continue to educate the angling public about best practices for catch and release, things that they can easily do. And I really appreciate the time and effort of all of you on the panel. You guys have been involved with the campaign since we started, and you're just doing a great job on your own as well as contributing to this campaign. We really just want to let everybody get the word that there's things that they can do in their daily angling practices that help preserve the future of this important fishery. So again, thanks guys for participating today and for all your support.
Thanks, John. Yeah.